Have you ever felt that something's amiss in our world? That a hidden force is at play behind the scenes? In a time when trust in our political leaders is at an all-time low, our intuition is telling us there is something wrong in our reality. Yet we cannot pinpoint exactly what is wrong. As the great Manly P. Hall once said, "It's not the wrath of the Almighty, but the stupidity of man that is causing most of the trouble." This podcast is not about personal gain or fortune. I'm here because I recognize that in the crisis of overwhelming ignorance and deception in which we live, I have a moral obligation to communicate what I know to be taking place in our world in order for something to be done about it. Welcome to the Free Your Mind Canada podcast, where we dive into deep state politics, philosophy, the occult, spirituality, and above all else, natural law. This podcast is all about human freedom, and I'm your host, Adrian Cleveland, inviting you to join me on this enlightening journey.
I'll never surrender. I'll never surrender. I'll never surrender.
All right, welcome to episode 6 on war. This is something that has an ostensible purpose versus a true purpose. Once again, what do we mean by ostensible? It means represented or appearing as such, not actually being what appearance indicates, suggesting an appearance to unaided senses, not borne out by rigorous examination or greater knowledge, based on deceptive resemblance or faulty observation, or influenced by emotions that prevent a clear view, or illusory. So what are the ostensible purposes for war? We're told that it's there to protect a nation from foreign threats, defend freedom and liberty, protect others in foreign countries who can't protect themselves, oust brutal regimes and dictators, and bring peace and democracy to the world. So, truth is the first casualty in war. So, to start this off, let's talk about World War I, a little bit of history of that conflict, and really a hidden history of this conflict. And we're told that it started by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on June 28, 1914. And what this did, this set in motion the interlocking clockwork of alliances and military mobilization plans in Europe. This really started based on it was an inter-imperial rivalry in Europe amongst the nation states, and it was between the current empire, which was Britain, and the up-and-coming empire of Germany. And Germany was set to rival and even surpass the British Empire economically, technologically, and even militarily. Supporting British Empire was the primary motive of Canada joining the war. So, in other words, we had a ruling empire at the time, the British Empire, and behind the scenes, this conflict started not just the interlocking of military alliances, but Germany was becoming its own empire of power, and the rulers to be couldn't have that. They wanted Britain to rule over the sun. So we need to talk about a hidden group called the Milner Group. And this was the real political power behind World War I. It was a secret society consisting of 3 influential people in Britain William T. Stead, he was a newspaper editor and pioneer of tabloid journalism. Then you had Reginald Brett, who later named himself Lord Esher, and he was the confidant and advisor of Queen Victoria, King Edward, and King George. And the other party was Cecil Rhodes, which was a wealthy diamond mine magnate in South Africa. So these are three highly prominent people within Britain that got together and created a secret society. And one of them is an advisor to the monarchy. So the secret society consists of two circles: an inner circle called the Society of the Elect, who are to direct the activity of the larger outer circle dubbed the Association of Helpers, who are not to know the inner circle's existence. So you have this outer circle of workers that have no clue that there's an inner circle to this secret society directing the show. Milner Group's objective was a secret organization dedicated to the quote extension of British rule throughout the world and quote the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire, end quote. So the American Revolution, which got America out of Britain's empire, all of a sudden here's the secret society in Britain that wants to bring America back under British rule. And the article headline, it's called Mr. Rhodes's Ideal of Anglo-Saxon Greatness, end quote, and carried the remarkable subhead called He Believed a Wealthy Secret Society Should Work to Secure the World's Peace and a British-American Federation, end quote. And he summarized this sensational plan by knowing that Rhodes's, quote, idea for the development of the English-speaking race was the foundation of a society copied as to the organization of the Jesuits, end quote. So they want to create like a secret society like the Jesuits. Noting that his vision involved uniting, quote, the United States Assembly and our House of Commons to achieve the peace of the world, end quote. The article quotes Rhodes as saying, the only thing feasible to carry out this idea is a secret society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world. Rhodes would later die in 1902, but his work continued in his last will and testaments by William T. Stead. So here was this secret society. They wanted to get America back involved with it. It was as secret as the Jesuits. And here we go again with the justification of we represent what's right in the world, and then we're going to impose what we think is correct on everybody else. Seems to be a reoccurring theme for those that are in power. And really, the Milner Group was about imperialism, not peace, like they claimed. Its primary interest was war, not peace. Starting with the Boer War, with the interest of both bringing South America under British imperial control and benefit from the rich gold deposits. This was admitted by Inner Circle member Alfred Milner, quote, I precipitated the crisis, which was inevitable before it was too late. It is not very agreeable and in many eyes not a very credible price of business to have been largely instrumental in bringing about a war, end quote. Rhodes told Stead, quote, you will support Milner in any measure that he may take short of war. I make no such limitation. I support Milner absolutely without reserve. If he says peace, I say peace. If he says war, I say war. Whatever happens, I say ditto to Milner. End quote. So this form of imperialism created by a secret society, it really is a new form of colonialism. So Milner Group starts taking aim at Germany. So from the Boer War on, the Milner Group saw Germany as the biggest threat to British hegemonic power. They seized control of the press, the military, and diplomatic machinery of the British Empire by putting their men into key positions to turn public perception against Germany. This included putting their own point man as foreign secretary. These were the men who put together that entangled web of diplomatic alliances and military compacts and orchestrated the inter-European tensions which sprung the world into war after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So it was no coincidence that any of that happened starting off World War I. These were the guys behind orchestrating and social engineering that whole situation. So the next thing they want to do is they want to embroil America into the war. One of Milner Group's objectives was to bring America back into the British Empire. The Milner Group, their co-conspirators would later go on to be the members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They found no shortage of co-conspirators in the US, such as J.P. Morgan, so international bankers, the Pilgrim Society, or they just lured other people in by money. Co-conspirator Edward Mandell House made Woodrow Wilson his protege and would become their political frontman. Wilson had no chance of winning against William Taft, so J.P. Morgan bankrolled Teddy Roosevelt to split the Republican vote, making Wilson win the election. So Woodrow Wilson was a big nobody, and he ended up meeting up with this guy called Edward Mandell House, who would later just call himself Colonel House. And that guy was a member of the Milner Group. So he was the guy, he was the puppet master behind Woodrow Wilson. He's the one that is the architect of his policies. So during this time, Woodrow Wilson would then create the Federal Reserve Act and send America into World War I. So this is the United States president with the Milner Group as his real puppet masters, bringing in the Federal Reserve, bringing in income tax, and bringing America into a European war, World War I, because America at the time was actually a non-interventionist state, unlike it is now. It didn't get involved in Europe's wars. And that's how Woodrow Wilson ruined America and brought them back into what's called the Anglo-American establishment. So bringing America back into the British Empire that they fought against. So war really is an instrument of change for the ruling class. For the would-be engineers of society, war was the easiest way to demolish the old traditions and beliefs that lay between them and their goals. Change people's perception and attitudes about government, the economy, and social responsibility. So progressivism. So at this point, governments were more classical liberal. There wasn't social services. There wasn't income tax. There wasn't social services. There wasn't free stuff. There wasn't free Medicare and free this, free that. The government was just there to protect your rights. And all of a sudden, World War I comes around. They saw this as an opportunity to start implementing those social programs. So Germany instituted war socialism over their entire economy. Canada rushed to nationalize railways, outlaw alcohol, institute official censorship of newspapers, levy conscription, and infamously introduce a personal income tax as a, quote, temporary wartime measure, end quote. And here we are today, still paying income tax when we were never meant to pay income tax. We were never meant to have these social programs because it was understood under the Enlightenment that that was not the legitimate function of government. Government was never there to give you free shit. Dewey, for example, wrote of, quote, the social possibilities of war, end quote. And he wrote in there, in every warring country, there has been the same demand that in the time of great national stress, production for profit be subordinated to production for use. Legal possession and individual property rights have had to give way before social requirements. The old conception of the absoluteness of private property has received the world over a blow from which it will never wholly recover. And so these are the technocrats that are just justifying instituting socialism within liberal democratic governments. So World War I and its instrument of change for the ruling class led to a complete redrawing of the map and collapse of monarchies and empires, just like the Milner group wanted. So they can be the empire that's in control. So the partition of Asiatic Turkey, which created the modern Middle East out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. The treaty with Italy, promising conquered territory to Italy in exchange for military aid against Austria-Hungary. Redrawing the frontiers of Germany, promising France its long-held wish for reacquiring Alsace-Lorraine. The Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, which divided modern day into Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And lastly, the Balfour Declaration, which was addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild, so international banker, stating British support for establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So if you want to know the origins of all these conflicts that we see in the Middle East, it was this Milner group around World War I divvying up the area. So really, the World War I is the end of the beginning. World War I was not the war to end all wars, as they said it was, but was rather the end to the beginning of how geopolitics and conflict arise in the modern world. So like I said, we had World War I. All of a sudden, we have a split of the Middle East, and we have the Palestinians' land taken over and creating a Jewish state called Israel. This is the source of those conflicts. So we had World War I, and then they made Germany pay for the reparations of the war, even though it was inter-European rivalry. So Britain and the rest of the Allied countries were just at fault as Germany. Ruined their economy by making them pay reparations. So this was the creation of the Bank of International Settlements under the guise of paying for reparations. Destroying the German dollar, destroying the German economy, allowing a dictator to become popular and rise in power. Then we had World War II, dropping of the atomic bomb, creating the Cold War against the West and the Eastern communists. And now we have the war on terrorism based on the Milner's group splitting up the Middle East. So the hidden history of World War I is a case study how war has nothing to do with elected parliaments or representative democracy, but how it is started for the interest of the ruling elite. So war has nothing to do about somebody attacking us. War has nothing to do about what our elected officials, politicians tell us is going to create safety and security. It's all orchestrated by a small group of individuals, and that small group started off as the Milner Group under the British Empire. So in war, we have to ask the question, qui bono? So who benefits? And some of the groups that benefits are the imperialists that want to have hegemonic empire over the world. And we just talked about them. They were called the Milner Group. Who else benefits? The bankers, so the central bankers, and corporations. And what do they get out of this? They get a profit, money. There is a shit ton of money to be made in war. Let's talk about the bankers first. All bankers are bankers' wars. Wars are extremely expensive endeavors that can only be paid for through financing. So governments really do not generate enough money for the arms and the munitions to go to war. The only way you can get the money to go to war is by the nation taking on debt. So you're back to going to the bankers. And we see this today with the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and you see how in debt the United States government is. So in World War I, over $3 billion was brokered to Britain by the Morgan Bank, with $400 million going in overdraft, as well as other arrangements that the bankers had with the Allies. If the Allies were to lose the war, there was no clear end in sight. The loans could not be repaid. So the bankers had an invested interest in getting America into the war and seeing the Allies win the war. So these international bankers, JP Morgan and crew, gave a shit ton of loans to Britain. And it wasn't just, hey, they look like they may be winning the war. It looks like this might be a decisive victory. There was no end in sight. And there was no clear indication that Britain would have won the war. And so these bankers would have lost their investment. And bankers don't play the game to lose. So all of a sudden it's, hey, in order to win this war, we need to get America involved and get them on the side of the Allies so Britain can win the war, so the bankers can make their money back. So there was a whole objective there to get America embroiled in the war, not because it was the moral or right thing to do. It was bankers need their money. Next, let's talk about corporations and the military-industrial complex. Guys, start off with a quote here. Quote, "War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of a very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. In the World War, so World War I, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their tax returns? No one knows. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried a bayonet thrust of an enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? End quote. And that was by a book by Major General Smedley Butler. He was the most decorated U.S. Marine at the time after World War I. And he was, quote, trying to educate the soldiers out of the sucker class, end quote. And so here was this battle-hardened U.S. Marine, and he started to see what war was really about. And he was seeing all these corporations that were making a killing, literally, like profit-wise, off the backs of U.S. soldiers going to war. And so Bernard Branch, who was the powerful financier who personally led Woodrow Wilson into the Democratic headquarters in New York, quote, like a poodle on a string, so another one of his puppet masters, was appointed to head the newly created, quote, War Industries Board, and personally profited $200 million from creating this board for the U.S. government. So, and here's a quote here. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of the combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together, end quote. And that was President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961. And this is the first time we heard the term coined, military-industrial complex. And he was one of the main U.S. presidents instrumental in creating an military industry in the United States. And it was getting bigger and bigger, and he was trying to warn that only the American population can keep that war machine in check. And what happened? None of us kept it in check. It just got bigger and bigger to the point now where the military-industrial complex really runs or influences the U.S. government in terms of conflicts. So the military-industrial complex. So it's really a three-way triangle of, you have the government, which is the legislative branch, the Defense Department, which is an executive branch of government, and industry. And so the issue with this is the industry ends up lobbying politicians by campaign contributions. So that's one way that the politicians are corrupted. The second way that the government's corrupted on the executive branch is you end up having a revolving door between the executive branch and industry. So in other words, you could have somebody that's in the executive branch that is a civil service employee, goes over to the private sector because they pay a lot of money, and then all of a sudden they'll work for the private sector and then go back into the executive branch of government. So they are completely influenced by corporate power. The other way that the government can be corrupted through the military-industrial complex is through political engineering. So not just campaign contributions, but they so-called create jobs. And what these military-industrial complex corporations do is they'll distribute their division of labor throughout the country. So they'll create jobs in multiple communities. So it's not just, hey, if you want to shut down Lockheed Martin, you're not just shutting them down in California. You'd be shutting down multiple jobs in multiple communities throughout the United States. And you can really tell how influential the military-industrial complex is in the United States, because this is one bipartisan issue Congress agrees on, whether they're Democrat or Republican. And those are two political parties that can never agree on anything. Yet when it comes to war and spending money on war, they're all for it. So it tells you who our politicians are actually working for. So 40% of military spending in the world is by the US, more than the top 10 countries combined. And so you know where all that money's going to is going right into the hands of these corporations. And we're told it's needed to, quote, spread democracy and, quote, defend authoritarianism. So the growing threat of foreign powers is because the U.S., because of the United States weaponization, reduces national security. So in other words, the United States keeps increasing their level of arms. We have F-15 fighter jets, and now we've sold those F-15 fighter jets to other nations. And now, because those other nations have F-15 fighter jets, that's a threat to us. So we need to create another fighter jet that is far technologically superior. And then it's this arms race that goes on and on and on and on and on, that the United States has to have the bigger, better equipment. And really they've created a whole economy behind it. And that's not really an economically feasible thing to do, as you can see with the amount of debt the United States has taken on. Not to mention, it is a form of tyranny, because you may think the military is there to fight for your freedom, but it can also be a tyrannical system used against the people as well. So if the government has more arms than the people have arms, then you're already under a state of tyranny. So the results of the military-industrial complex. So why did the US use inflated estimates of Russian missile capabilities to justify stockpiling a nuclear arsenal that was more than sufficient to destroy the planet several times over? We can thank the military-industrial complex. Why did America send 50,000 of its own to fight and die in the jungles of Vietnam, killing untold millions of Vietnamese, not to mention Cambodians, the military-industrial complex? Why did the US use the public's fear and anger over 9/11 and a phony panic over non-existent weapons of mass destruction to justify the illegal invasion and trillion-dollar occupation of Iraq, the military-industrial complex. Why did Nobel Peace Prize laureate Obama expand the fictitious, quote, war on terror into Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia, refuse to close Guantanamo despite his earlier promises to the contrary, commit U.S. forces to kinetic military action in Libya without so much as seeking congressional approval, and launch a new era of covert drone warfare? The military-industrial complex. So those drones that the United States were flying in the Middle East, they're expensive to run. And 90% of the targets that they drone strike failed to meet their actual targets. Instead, they hit villages and kill a lot of women and children. So you can imagine how that creates terrorism when you bomb somebody's family to death. And Obama had this thing called Terror Tuesdays, where he would go hunt down terrorists and be judge, jury, executioner without any due process of law, and apparently be a constitutional lawyer while doing it. So why has Trump not only continued, but further expanded the U.S. military presence in Africa, increased U.S. aid to Israel and Saudi Arabia, actively enabled the war crimes in Yemen that have led to the largest cholera outbreak in human history, and killed more civilians in his first 6 months in office than former drone king Obama killed in his entire 8-year presidency? The military-industrial complex. So how can a Secretary of Defense commission a study from a private sector contractor to examine whether the U.S. military should be using more private contractors, only for that same Secretary of Defense to leave office and become president of the company that conducted the study, only to leave that company to become vice president of the United States and begin waging a war that relies heavily on no-bid contracts awarded to the same company based on the recommendation that it made in its original study? The military-industrial complex. Yet this is precisely the case with Dick Cheney and Halliburton. So that is how bad the revolving door is between the United States government and the military-industrial complex. Essentially, these corporations are writing the rules and then going in government and implementing their rules for their benefit. This is the military-industrial fascism that Ike warned us about. So obviously, if governments want to go to war, they just can't tell people that what the truth is. They can't tell them that it's there so the bankers and the military-industrial complex can make a profit. Actually, that's another thing about the military-industrial complex. It's not just arms manufacturers. It's not just General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. There's a whole other aspect of it. So scientific research. So there's grants going to universities, and then the internet is computers and the internet are a prime example of the military industrial complex. Those were invented by DARPA. So, like I was saying, to sell a war, you can't tell people that you have to go out and fight and die and kill people in other countries just so a few elitists can make a shit ton of money. You have to tell them lies. And so you have to sell the war to the population, because most people wouldn't stand for the real reason why war happens. So how do you do this? Well, there's three things. It's demonize the other side through the use of propaganda, speak of lofty ideals in noble causes such as freedom, peace, security, doing away with evil, and false flags. either make it happen on purpose, let it happen on purpose, or provoke the other side. So let's talk about demonizing the other side. So this is leverage control of the press in key governmental positions to shape public perception and instill pro-war sentiment. The media only, and prior to this, is the media only gets its information from, quote, official sources. So in other words, they only get their information from the government and take kernels of truth and spin it over the top in attempts to portray the opposing side as inhuman brutes. So you could probably think of examples in our current world, if you watch the news, about media information only getting it from official sources. I know here in Canada, it's like you turn on CTV or you turn on CBC. They don't have any sort of counter argument. All the information they provide to Canadians comes straight out of the mouth of the government. So that's whose side they're on. And then kernels of truth and spinning it over the top. So this was a tactic used. It's used today, but used all the way through World War I. You had what was called, in this first poster here, it was called Babies on Bayonets, portraying German, in war propaganda posters, portraying Germans as taking their bayonets on their rifles and stabbing them through babies. And this is all to stir up emotions in people and make them angry. You had the crucifixion of the Canadian soldier, the claim that German soldiers were raping women. And in war, there's always bad being done on both sides. And of course, we shouldn't condone that. But it's the using that story to spin it into a bigger lie, to really get people riled up, to help justify the war. So Babies on Bayonets, people should look into it. And if you're paying attention when these new wars and conflicts come out, they're always looking for a way to sell you on it. So now if you know what the propaganda is, you can spot it in modern day, present times. So this tactic of Babies on Bayonets is still used to this day. And they keep using it because nobody challenges them on their tactics. So speak of lofty ideals. So embedded within the rhetoric of selling warfare that has been employed by president after president, prime minister after prime minister, in country after country, and war after war, right down to the current day. From it comes many of the phrases that we still recognize today as the language of lofty ideals and noble causes that always accompany the most bloody and ignoble wars. So the speak of lofty ideals, they usually come from the politicians, the high ones, the presidents, the prime ministers. And you know what it sounds like. You've heard it on the news every time they want to go to war and be in a conflict. So here's what George Bush Jr. said in September of 2001 on the war on terror. Freedom and fear are at war. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Now let's see what George Bush Sr. said in his time. We know what works. Freedom works. We know what's right. Freedom is right. So they're always trying to sell us on this notion of freedom. Yet they could never explain what freedom actually is. So let me quote this. This was Woodrow Wilson during World War I. And listen to the propaganda on this. With a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking, and of the grave responsibilities which it involves, but in unhesitating obedience to what I deem my constitutional duty, I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon and tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. So that was Woodrow Wilson in his address getting America into World War I. And you can see the propaganda in it. So they use the same lines. It's all about freedom. It's for democracy. We are doing, and then you got the Orwellian news speak in there, the double speak of we represent what's right, we represent what's good, but we're gonna go off and go murder and kill a bunch of people. So it's a contradiction, but it's made to sound like we are the fair and just ones. Once again, it's the people in power that always have to justify their use of power against other individuals. So let's go in. The next aspect of selling a war is false flags. And that is and part of false flags is to provoke the other side to attack in order to justify going to war. So a pretense. In other words, provoke the other side, make it so they attack you, and then they tell the public that, oh, this was an unprovoked attack, so this is a reason for us to go to war. False flags are MyHop, or they can be LieHop. So made it happen on purpose. So the government themselves orchestrating the attack on themselves to justify a pretense of war, or let it happen on purpose, as in somebody's attacking them and instead taking defensive action and preventing the attack, they just let it happen because they want the justification to go to war. So Operation Northwoods, Operation Gladio, and 9/11 are all smoke and guns that false flags are real and not conspiracy theories. So you need to look into these. Operation Northwoods, the Executive Security Council of the United States putting an operation on JFK's desk to create a false attack against the United States and blame it on Cuba as a justification to invade Cuba. Luckily rejected by JFK, who I think should win a Nobel Peace Prize. He stopped a nuclear war from happening on his own. He didn't rely on his security establishment, because after this incident and the Bay of Pigs incident, he realized just how corrupt his security establishment's thinking was. And there's an argument to be made that that's the motive behind why he was assassinated. Then you have Operation Gladio, instituted by NATO in Europe, I think Italy, to create car bombings and terrorist attacks and blame it on the communists, when really it was NATO that was behind the operation. And 9/11. If you believe the official story of 9/11 at this point, you're just an idiot. It's been 2 decades now. There's enough information out there that it's pretty obvious that what happened was not what the government said happened. So those are all smoking guns that that false flags do exist in our reality, and every war, every pretense, every justification for every single war and conflict we've been in has been preceded by a false flag.
If, as the old adage has it, the first casualty of war is the truth, then it follows that the first battle of any war is won by lies. Lies have always been used to sell war to a public that would otherwise be leery about sending their sons off to fight and die on foreign soil. In times long past, this was easy enough to accomplish. A proclamation by a king or queen was enough to set the machinery of war in motion. But in the modern age of democracy and volunteer armies, a pretense for war is required to rally the nation around the flag and motivate the public to fight. That is why every major conflict is now accompanied by its own particular bodyguard of lies. From false flag attacks to dehumanization of the enemy, here are all the examples you'll need to debunk a century of war lies. This is the Corbett Report. In 1915, the RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner en route from New York to Liverpool, was sunk by a German U-boat 11 miles off the coast of Ireland. The ship's sinking, which resulted in the death of 128 of the 139 Americans aboard, became a symbol of German evil and helped psychologically prepare the US public for their country's eventual entry into World War I. But every facet of the story of the Lusitania, as it has been presented to the public, was a deliberate lie or a lie by omission. The boat was not a purely civilian vessel carrying 3,813 40-pound unrefrigerated containers of cheese and 696 containers of butter, as the official manifest held, but gun cotton, in keeping with the shipment's stated destination, the Royal Navy's weapons testing establishment. It was not sunk by the German torpedo boat, but by secondary explosions from the munitions the ship was illegally carrying. It was not the victim of a cowardly German surprise attack. The German embassy placed a warning notice about the Lusitania in 50 American newspapers right next to Cunard's own listings. And the American ambassador to England at the time, Walter Hines Page, wrote to his son 5 days before the ship was sunk, asking, "If a British liner full of American passengers be blown up, what will Uncle Sam do? That's what's going to happen." So what did the official cover-up of the incident conclude? That the dastardly Germans had waged a perfidious sneak attack on an innocent peace boat, of course. And the rest, as they say, is history. A little over 2 decades later, America's entry into World War II came when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, killing over 2,400 American servicemen and civilians. But far from an unprovoked sneak attack, as the official government-approved history would have you believe, Pearl Harbor is best understood as a conspiracy to motivate the American public for war by first provoking and then allowing a Japanese strike on American targets. This is not even a controversial idea. It was commonly understood and discussed by many in the Roosevelt administration at the time. Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, noted in his diary that just the week before the attack, President Roosevelt had told him, "We were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday," and then solicited Stimson's advice on how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Around the same time, Roosevelt sent a message to all military commanders stating that the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. So how did FDR and his administration provoke the Japanese into attacking? In late 1940, Roosevelt ordered the United States fleet to be relocated from San Pedro to Pearl Harbor. The order incensed Admiral James Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet, who complained bitterly to FDR about the nonsensical decision. It left the fleet open to attack from every direction. It created a 2,000-mile-long supply chain that was vulnerable to disruption, and it packed the ships in together at Pearl Harbor, where they would be sitting ducks in the event of a bombing or torpedo raid. FDR, unable to counter these objections, went ahead with the plan and relieved Richardson of his command. Then, in June 1941, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes wrote a memo advising FDR to embargo Japanese oil in order to goad them into war. There might develop from the embargoing of oil to Japan such a situation as would make it not only possible, but easy to get into this war in an effective way. Roosevelt followed 3 weeks later with an order seizing Japanese assets in America and effectively preventing Japan from purchasing much-needed American oil, which at that time accounted for 4/5 of Japanese oil imports. The provocations had their intended effect, and the Americans listened in on Japanese war preparations via radio. They received warnings of an imminent attack from diplomatic officials and military attachés. The attack was even predicted by the Honolulu Advertiser days before it happened. But all of these warnings were ignored. Even today, nearly 80 years after the events, new documents and memos continue to be found showing more warnings that Roosevelt and his administration deliberately ignored in the run-up to the attack. FDR got his wish. The Japanese attack was successful. 2,400 Americans died, and the nation, outraged, responded by rallying around the flag and jumping enthusiastically into war. But the Japanese themselves were no innocents when it came to lying their way into war. 10 years before Pearl Harbor, in 1931, Japan was looking for a pretext to invade Manchuria. On September 18th of that year, a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of TNT along a Japanese-owned railway in the Manchurian city of Mukden. The act was blamed on Chinese dissidents and used to justify the invasion and occupation of Manchuria. When the lie was later exposed, Japan was diplomatically shunned and forced to withdraw from the League of Nations. The League of Nations fell apart precisely for its inability to prevent World War II. Its successor organization, the United Nations, engaged in its own war lies shortly after its creation to ensure that it would not meet the same fate. The Korean War, waged under the UN flag and sold to the public as a virtuous mission to save the South from the North's communist aggression, was on its face a war that should never have happened. The division of Korea into North and South was not the organic decision of the Korean people, but a plan that originated in an article in 1944 in Foreign Affairs, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which suggested dividing the country up and putting its administration in the hands of the Allies, including the Soviets. When the newly founded UN put that plan into action in 1945, Korea was arbitrarily divided along the 38th parallel, with the US administering the South, and the Soviet Union administering the North. Neither was the war itself the organic result of decisions taken by the Korean people. In 1949, Owen Lattimore, a member of the Carnegie and Rockefeller-funded Institute for Pacific Relations and an advisor to the State Department on East Asian issues, wrote, "The thing to do is let South Korea fall, but not to let it look as if we pushed it." In a speech at the National Press Club the following year, Secretary of State Dean Acheson placed Korea outside of the US's defense perimeter of the Pacific, stating that any attack that took place outside of that perimeter would have to be dealt with under the Charter of the United Nations. Taking this as a green light, the North Koreans, heavily fortified and equipped with Soviet military aid, invaded the South. The war began on June 27, 1950, when the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for members to provide military assistance to restore international peace and security in the area. The Soviet Union, being a veto-wielding member of the Council, could have vetoed the resolution and prevented the UN from engaging in the war, but they abstained from the vote altogether. When General MacArthur, leading the UN forces, managed to repel the North right to the Chinese border, he was prevented from completing the mission by Truman, who would not authorize any operations north of the Soviet-held 38th parallel unless there was no chance of confrontation with either Chinese or Soviet forces. MacArthur, shocked by this development, wrote in a letter years later, "Such a limitation upon the utilization of available military force to repel an enemy attack has no precedent either in our own history or, so far as I know, in the history of the world. To me, it clearly foreshadowed the tragic situation which has since developed and left me with a sense of shock I had never before experienced in a long life crammed with explosive reactions and momentous hazards." In the end, the bloody Korean conflict ended not with a peace deal, but a ceasefire. not with the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, but with the establishment of a demilitarized zone to keep them separated. Nearly 3 million civilians died during the fighting, and the country was torn to pieces, all in the name of a military action under the UN flag that should never have escalated into war in the first place. In August of 1964, President Johnson was preoccupied in finding an excuse to justify a formal escalation of American military involvement in Vietnam. That excuse came on August 2nd when the USS Maddox, a destroyer supposedly on a peaceful mission in international waters, reported a surprise attack from North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Just 2 days later, it reported another attack. Johnson responded by launching retaliatory strikes and signing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, thus formally launching the Vietnam War. Years later, it was revealed that the story of the Maddox too had been a tissue of lies. The Maddox was not peacefully drifting near Vietnamese waters, minding its own business. It was part of a covert electronic warfare campaign assisting the South Vietnamese in launching attacks on the North. It had not been attacked out of the blue on August 2nd as originally reported, but in fact had fired first. And, as even the NSA's own internal publication, made available to the public for the first time 40 years after the incident, concluded, the second attack on August 4th had never taken place at all. But these were mere details, and just like the facts about the Lusitania and Pearl Harbor, these details were suppressed long enough for the event to have its intended effect, rallying the public for war. The Six-Day War in 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan is yet another example of a war which was justified for reasons that were later exposed as lies. When Israel launched an attack on Egypt's airfields on the morning of June 5th, they initially claimed that it was a defensive strike and that Egypt had struck first. But this was an easily proven lie, and the claim was quickly dropped. Next, they claimed that the attack was preemptive self-defense, and that Egypt and its Arab allies had been preparing to strike Israel. But multiple Israeli officials, including Yitzhak Rabin, later admitted that Egypt had not been preparing a war, or even interested in one. And then, in the most outrageous incident of all, Israel attempted to get America involved in the war by attacking the USS Liberty, a U.S. technical research ship collecting electronic intelligence just outside Egypt's territorial waters at the time of the war. The attack, carried out by Israeli fighter jets and torpedo boats, was relentless. The Liberty was strafed and torpedoed repeatedly, with the crew sending distress messages and even hoisting a large American flag so there could be no doubt as to their identity. The Israeli attack was finally called off an hour and a half into the assault. Israel, caught in a blatant attempt to sink an American ship, offered an apology for mistaking the identity of the vessel. But it was no mistake. In 2007, the NSA declassified intercepts confirming that the Israelis knew they were attacking an American ship, not an Egyptian ship, as their cover story is maintained. Even mainstream historians now characterize Israel's attack on the Liberty as a daring ploy by Israel to fake an Egyptian attack on the American spy ship and thereby provide America with a reason to officially enter the war against Egypt. But the incident was soon memory hold, and to this day, the Six-Day War is portrayed as an act of preemptive self-defense by the valiant Israelis against the dastardly Arab aggressors. By the 1990s, the post-Vietnam public was growing increasingly wary of calls for war in far-flung corners of the world in countries many had never heard of. And so it was that in 1990, when the politicians and their deep state controllers required the American public to be motivated to wage war against Iraq for its invasion of Kuwait, they hired a literal PR firm to sell an even more brazen set of lies to Joe Sixpack and Jane Soccer Mom. The most famous of these lies revolved around Nayira, a young Kuwaiti girl who sparked international headlines for her shocking testimony before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus in October 1990. In a tear-stained speech, she told a harrowing story of the horrors she witnessed being committed by Iraqi soldiers at a Kuwaiti hospital where she was volunteering.
The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer, The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
It's difficult today to understand just how important this testimony was in setting the tone of the debate about whether America should commit military forces to defend Kuwait. It was reported breathlessly on the evening news, and it was repeated by President Bush on not one or two occasions, but 6 separate times in the lead-up to war.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor. And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Then, when the Gulf War resolution was making its way through the House, the incubator story was raised in Congress.
Now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
And then again in the Senate. The vote passed, and combat operations formally began in January 1991. The only problem? Nayirah was not some anonymous Kuwaiti girl, but, as a subsequent CBC investigation discovered, she was Nayirah al-Sabah, daughter of Saud al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Her testimony had been written for her by Hill & Knowlton, a PR company hired by the Kuwaiti government-supported AstroTurf organization, the Citizens for a Free Kuwait, to help sell the Gulf War. And the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that held the hearing where Nayirah gave her testimony? It was later found to be a Hill & Knowlton front itself. As everyone knows by now, the second Gulf War in 2003 was also built on lies. We all remember the lies about Saddam's WMDs and the way that story was sold to the public by Colin Powell at the UN. But this time, the media took the driver's seat in the campaign to sell the war to the public. The New York Times led the way with Judith Miller's now infamous reporting on the Iraqi WMD story, now known to have been based on false information from untrustworthy sources. But the rest of the media quickly fell into line, with the NBC Nightly News asking, what precise threat Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction pose to America? And Time debating whether Hussein was making a good faith effort to disarm Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Reports about chemical weapon stashes were reported on before they were confirmed, although headlines boldly asserted their existence as indisputable fact. And any media personality that showed skepticism about the claims being made, even wildly popular ones like Phil Donahue, host of MSNBC's then highest-rated program, were summarily removed from the air.
Scott Ritter is here, and so is Ambassador Butler.
You had Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, who was saying that if we invade, it'll be a historic blunder.
Yes, but we didn't have Malone. He had to be there with someone else who supported the war. In other words, you couldn't have Scott Ritter alone. You could have Richard Furl alone.
You could have the conservative.
You could have the supporters of the president alone. And they would say why this war is important. You couldn't have a dissenter alone. Our producers were instructed to feature 2 conservatives for every liberal.
You're kidding.
No, this is absolutely
instructed
true.
From above?
Yes.
We now know that, in fact, the stockpiles did not exist, and the administration premeditatedly lied the country into yet another war. But the most intense opposition the Bush administration ever received over this documented war crime was some polite correction on the Sunday political talk show circuit.
You and a few other critics are the only people I've heard use the phrase immediate threat. I didn't. The president didn't. And it's become kind of folklore that that's what's happened. The president went...
You're saying that nobody in the administration said that?
I can't speak for nobody and everybody in the administration and say nobody said that.
Vice President didn't say that?
If you have any citations, I'd like to see them.
We have one here that says, some have argued that this is you speaking, some have argued that the nuclear threat from Iraq is not imminent, that Saddam is at least 5 to 7 years away from having nuclear weapons. I would not be so certain.
Mm-hmm. And
close to imminent.
Well, I tried to be precise and I've tried to be accurate.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
The WMD story blew up in the neocons' face shortly after the war, but by that time they had already succeeded in their plan to reshape the Middle East. But for the would-be controllers of public opinion, a valuable lesson was learned. Human rights and protecting the innocent is a more effective lie to sell to the public to motivate them for war. So when it came time to sell the war on Libya to the public, the UN-backed, NATO-led aggressors once again donned the cloak of human rights by turning to none other than the UN's Human Rights Council. The process that launched the intervention was begun by a coalition of 70 non-governmental organizations, which issued a joint letter urging the UN to suspend Libya from the Human Rights Council, and for the Security Council to invoke the so-called responsibility to protect principle in protecting the Libyan people from alleged atrocities being committed by the Libyan government. In a special session on the issue on February 25, 2011, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution affirming the NGO's recommendations. The resolution was adopted without a vote. The Security Council immediately passed resolutions 1970 and 1973, authorizing the establishment of a no-fly zone on Libyan military aviation for the protection of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. 3 days later, using the resolution as its justification, the US, UK, and France began bombing the population of Libya. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, began working on the legal basis for the invasion. He drafted the request for the court's judges to issue an arrest warrant for Gaddafi for crimes against humanity. Although NATO forces were already engaged in an invasion of the country on the basis of undocumented allegations by a group of NGOs, Moreno Ocampo's request was not issued until May 16th. On June 28th, the day after the judges agreed to issue the warrant, Moreno Ocampo participated in a press conference in which one reporter asked about the evidence that Gaddafi had ever engaged in the atrocities he was accused of.
I advise you to read the application of the prosecutor's office, many pages, I think it was 77 pages. We describe in detail the facts, most of it is public. And the judges also decided, analyzing the evidence. So, of course, we are prosecutors and judges, so we rely on facts. So we prove the crimes. That's what we did.
Although the document that Moreno Ocampo urges the public to read to understand the evidence of Gaddafi's crimes is indeed public, and is 77 pages long, the version made available to the public has been heavily redacted. In fact, of the 77 pages, 54 of them have been redacted, comprising the entire section of the document dealing with the evidence for the charges themselves. The most sickening part of this war lie is just how obvious it was. No one involved in this charade cared about the well-being of the Libyan people. Not the press, not the politicians, not the ICC prosecutors. And as a result, today, 7 years after the destruction of Libya at the hands of the United Nations-sanctioned NATO saviors, open-air slave markets are running in the country that the human rights crusaders once pretended to care about. False flags, provocateur conflicts, fake news, and fake human rights crusades. Throughout the last century, a host of methods have been employed to keep the public playing the military-industrial complex's game. And over that century, the blood of untold millions has flowed as a direct result of these war lies. Truth is the first casualty of war, as they say. But if we desire peace, then we must confront the liars with our knowledge of these war lies. And armed with this truth, the public finally stands a chance of stopping the next war before the warmongers can conjure it into existence.
So there you have it. Every war, every conflict we've been in has been started based on a justification of war lies and false flag incidents. So it's, like I said, it's not a conspiracy theory that false flags exist. They actually do indeed exist and happen every single time we get ourselves into a conflict. And find it rather sad that, well, the current conflicts that are going on, the war in Ukraine and the genocide of the Palestinian people by the Israelis, I find it rather, sad that people are so naive to listen to what the mainstream media has to say about it, when this is the exact same mainstream media that lied to you about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and provided zero evidence for that, and also provided zero evidence for Osama bin Laden being behind the World Trade Center attacks. So it's so obvious that they're lying to people in the mainstream media news, and yet people are still falling for it every time. So let's talk about a modern day conflict going on. So we have what was considered the start of the war on terror. So 9/11, the war on terror, and let's talk about NATO.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world, using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly, answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her, and her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
his head could be seen to move violently forward.
And
they took the babies out of the incubators.
And
mobile production facilities.
And
the rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit, paranoid, tinfoil, dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
So in essence, that's the story of 9/11 in a short 5-minute clip. And I dare you to fact check all of that. What is evident is that everything that the mainstream sources, the US government has said about 9/11 has been nothing but a big lie. And this was the lie used to justify us going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, and starting this so-called war on terror, and blaming it on Osama bin Laden just days, weeks, if not days after the attacks happened, when really a real investigation would have taken time and would be full of false leads and rabbit holes. And they supposedly knew right away who did it, with zero evidence for the claim, by the way, that it was Osama bin Laden that created the 9/11 attacks. They went to the Taliban and said, give us Osama bin Laden or we'll bomb you. And the Taliban actually agreed to give the United States Osama bin Laden and condemn the atrocities, but said, well, if we're going to give him to you, you got to give us evidence that he actually committed the crime, which is any rational person's thought would be, of course so. But instead of the US producing any evidence that he did it, they're like, nope, we're just going to bomb you in Afghanistan. And really, because they didn't have any evidence to begin with that he did it.
First of all, when we use the term terror, we have to recognize that, like most terms of political discourse, it has two meanings. There's a literal meaning, and there's the doctrinal meaning. Now, in the literal meaning, terror is what's described in U.S. Code of Laws. It's the threat or use of violence to intimidate, typically against civilians, to intimidate populations for political, ideological, and other ends. Well, nobody can use that definition, because if you use that definition, it follows instantly that the United States is a leading terror state, that Britain is another leading terror state, and so on. So the literal definition, the one that's in the U.S. Code of Laws, is unusable. Then we go to the doctrinal definition, the one that's used in the media and scholarship and so on. That's the same as the official definition, but with a qualification. It only applies to what they do to us, not what we do to them. Okay, that's the doctrinal meaning. I'll now use it in the doctrinal sense. That's totally dishonest, of course. As to what to do about the threat of terror in the doctrinal sense, meaning the terror by them against us, there are a lot of things to do. One thing is to not increase the threat. That's a simple step. Don't act in order to increase the threat. Now, the U.S. consistently, and Britain, act in order to increase the threat of terror. Not because they want terror, but because it's just not a high priority. So take the invasion of Iraq. As I mentioned, that was undertaken with the expectation, since amply confirmed, that it would increase the threat of terror. They expected it. It happened. Well, one of the ways not to increase the threat of terror is not to take steps like that that'll increase it. Another, and just about unanimity on this in the among specialists and intelligence agencies. Second step is to try to ask what its reasons are. What are the causes of it? And where the causes are grievances that are legitimate grievances, something should be done about those grievances, quite apart from the threat of terror. It's another way to reduce it. We have, but well, let me get to Canada. First of all, in the case of Canada, it may turn out that the motivation for the terror was Canadian troops in Afghanistan. You might look into that. But whatever it is, if there are grievances, then something should be done. Beyond that, terror is a police problem. So if you find a terrorist cell, if it's legitimate in Canada, yeah, then you should arrest the perpetrators and they should be subjected to trial, just as the leading terrorists should be, like the ones in the White House. But of course, we're doing it only keeping to the doctrinal sense, so it's only them against us.
The one question that literally was never asked is what was the motive in why terrorists decided to sacrifice their own lives and kill people in Belgium? Like, why would they do that? It was just assumed these are savages and barbaric monsters with this primitive, inscrutable religion. I've lived in Brazil for the last 10 years. Brazil is a non-Muslim country, overwhelmingly Catholic and evangelical. It's also a free and open and democratic society. There's never any talk about Muslims targeting Brazil. The same is true in Japan or Korea or Argentina or Chile or dozens of democratic non-Muslim countries around the world. Why is that? Is it that the terrorists just put the names of all the countries into a paper bag and like randomly pull the ones out and that they're going to attack? Or is there something that is true about the governments and policies of the countries they attack that is causing them to become targets? And there's tons of evidence, as Professor Chomsky said, but just go to Google and Google 2004 Rumsfeld report on terrorism. Because Donald Rumsfeld in 2004 asked this question. He said, why are there so many people who hate the United States so much that they're willing to give up their own lives to attack and kill Americans? And the answer that Donald Rumsfeld's commission said was, it said, you know what, these people, they don't hate us for our freedoms, and they don't hate us because they're involved in a religious war or because they have this religion that hypnotizes them into committing violence. They hate us because of our policies. Overwhelming support for Israel, occupying and bombing their countries, killing their children, propping up their dictators. And so, as Professor Chomsky said, we can continue to engage in those policies that our own government says in secret causes terrorism, or if we're really serious about stopping it, we don't need to spend tens of billions of dollars and tell the government to spy on us. We can ask ourselves, what is it that we can be doing differently that lessens that desire and dilutes and weakens that infrastructure?
If I can just add a word, that report was quite interesting, and particularly interesting was that it was a repeat of a National Security Council document from 1958. When that's one of the advantages of living in a free society where you can get declassified documents. President Eisenhower in 1958 asked his staff, why is there a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not from the governments, but from the populations? And there happened to be a National Security Council study that came out that year, which gave the answer. It said there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports brutal and dictatorial regimes and blocks democracy and development, and that we do it because we want to make sure we can control their resources and their policies. And then it said these perceptions are more or less accurate, but we should continue doing it because that's in our interest. So the Rumsfeld report is repeating what we should know and what the victims do know. They don't have to read secret documents to find out. There's a real problem, but the answer, and we have to make a decision as to how to deal with it. One decision we can make is to follow the playbook that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have presented and want us to follow. Namely, and they're very explicit about it. Destroy your own societies, destroy your own freedom and liberty, and get into a war with the Muslim world. That's their playbook. We can accept that if we like. We've been doing it for 15 years. If you go back 15 years to the launching of the so-called war on terror, terrorism, what we call terrorism, was located in a tiny area of tribal areas of what we call Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where is it now? All over the world. Every time you hit it with a sledgehammer, it expands. The invasion of Iraq, for example, one of the effects was that in the year following it, terrorism increased by a factor of 7. Intelligence agencies had predicted that it would lead to more terror, but it was way beyond. And that continues. There's another possibility, and that is to try to get to the roots and the causes of it and try to deal with them. It's not dramatic and exciting, but it would work. And there's plenty of research that tells us why people turn to terrorism. Take a look at the British in Northern Ireland. Terrorism in England was pretty serious for a long time, much more than it is now. Fortunately, they didn't react by carpet bombing Northern Ireland following Ted Cruz's proposal. They finally, after a long period of doing the wrong thing, reacting with violence, they began to consider the reasons and the causes and to deal with them. And didn't turn into a paradise, but it's a big difference. I was in Belfast in 1993, and it was a war zone, literally. I was there 15 years later. It was, you could see tensions, but it was a pretty normal city. And some of the people who had been hitmen for the IRA were now part of the negotiating teams. That's the way you deal with it if you want to end the terrorism. If you want to follow the playbook outlined by Osama bin Laden and his successors, then hit it with a sledgehammer.
So many questions that we could ask, but let's just cut to the chase here, because what you need to know about this is that ISIS is not the creation of American inaction, which is what the media is going to tell you. No, they are the product of direct action. First, the action of creating a power vacuum in Iraq, and secondly, arming violent jihadists, hoping they would overthrow a leader in a neighboring Middle Eastern country. McAdams says the U.S. government is a victim of its own insane policies.
Well, I think the U.S. is really a hostage to its own regime change philosophy. The U.S. is very good at blowing things up and destroying societies, but it is very, very bad at putting them back together.
Is that true? Well, you decide. Fact. Our government armed Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and created Al-Qaeda. Fact. Our government helped supply Saddam Hussein chemical weapons for him to use against Iran in 1980 and then overthrew him in 2003. Fact. Our government trained rebel fighters in Syria who have become the group today known as ISIS, or the Islamic State. We have watched them commit every violent atrocity that you can imagine to people living in Iraq and Syria. And now we want American taxpayers to fund a 30-year war against them. No, it's not the U.S. government being held hostage by these crazy policies. It's the American people. And it's time that we reject the destruction of people groups around the world for the sake of foreign policy that makes so-called defense contractors rich and perpetuates violence, death, and destruction. of entire people groups, because humanity is greater than politics.
So there you have it. Terrorism and these terrorist organizations are a creation from the United States government and the West. So as Noam Chomsky and Glenn Greenwald was explaining, and this is within the United States government's own internal documents, that the United States does not support democracy. They support status quo governments and dictators, all so they can control oil in the Middle East. And further to this, you got the United States funneling funds and arms to Afghanistan, to the Mujahideen, to bleed the Soviets dry. And it was known as Charlie Wilson's War, the largest amount of funding and arms sent to a foreign nation, which would later become Al-Qaeda. And then we go 20 years later, and here we are fighting the people that our own governments have funded and trained and armed. And then you have ISIS, which came into power after the United States' initial withdrawal from Iraq under the Obama administration, leaving their arms and ammunition for ISIL to take. And you're telling me that the largest military and intelligence agency in the world wasn't smart enough to dismantle their arms infrastructure before they left? And then you have the United States government, while they were trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, sending arms and ammunition to rebel groups to overthrow the Syrian government. And these rebel groups were just defecting over to ISIS. And so all these little monsters that we fight, whether they're Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever you want to call them, they are a creation of the West. And funding and training and arms sent to them either directly from the United States or through their proxies out of Israel. And then we fight them 20 years later under the guise of so-called terrorism. So anybody with a brain should be able to figure out what's happening now when we're sending arms and ammunitions to a bunch of militia groups in Ukraine, what that's going to happen later on. And also under the Biden administration, the withdrawal of Afghanistan, leaving arms and ammunition behind for the Taliban. So we should be able to figure out what the hell happens when we send arms to militia groups, and yet we still allow our governments to do that to this day. And it's going to create failed states and justification for us to go into war again. So governments go into wars for conflicts that they themselves create. And then it's our sons and daughters that have to bleed over it. And it's the poor people in Iraq and Afghanistan that have to have their homes destroyed over a bunch of lies by a few elitists. So that's 9/11 and the war on terror. Let's talk about Canada's military policy. So is Canada a peacekeeping nation like the media claims it is? Indigenous peoples, NATO, economic stability, and the global south. So is Canada a peacekeeping nation? The notion that Canada is a peacekeeping nation is a myth that does not hold up to scrutiny. Peacekeeping is a marginal, if not irrelevant, part of Canadian foreign policy. In 2006, 72,784 UN peacekeeping personnel, only 56, so 0.077%, so not even 1%, were Canadian. Canada ranked 52nd out of 97 countries contributing to UN peacekeeping. Canada spent $6.2 million on peacekeeping versus $1.4 billion on the war in Afghanistan. So the numbers and statistics don't lie. Canada is not a UN peacekeeping force. Not that I really agree with UN peacekeeping missions, because they're ineffective and don't really do anything. But the notion that because Canada is involved in some of those missions make it a peacekeeping nation is not true. Another one of those lies and myths told to us by the mainstream media and their politicians. Let's talk about Indigenous nations and our military policy. It is not an overstatement to suggest that Canada views Indigenous struggles as one of the most pressing security challenges it faces. So Gustafsson, Ipperwash, and Oka are all examples of this. Oka was the largest military operation since the Korean War before Afghanistan. The RCMP shot 77,000 rounds of ammunition at Gustafsson. That's insane. Luckily, they're so incompetent that they didn't hit anybody and kill anybody. Counter-resistance often involves the RCMP, the OPP, the SQ, CSIS, and JTF2. And oftentimes these security agencies, their main target is Mohawk warrior societies who are actually popular in the community. But this is what governments do, is they can't take any sort of resistance to its continued control. And so they roll out the entire security establishment against them. And of course they want to target the Mohawk warrior societies because they're the ones that are military trained. They're the ones that, one, they're backed by the community, and two, they have the ability to resist the government through the use of force. And here's a quote here. The rise of radical Native American organizations, such as the Mohawk Warrior Society, can be viewed as insurgencies with specific and limited aims. Although they do not seek complete control of the federal government, they do seek particular political concessions in their relationship with national governments and control, either overt or covert, of political affairs at a local/reserve First Nation level through the threat of or the use of force, end quote. And that was in a September 2005 draft of the Department of National Defense's Counterinsurgency Manual. Mind you, they face a lot of criticism of it for putting that in, so it didn't go into the final draft of their counterinsurgency manual, but it speaks to the thinking of the Canadian military establishment. So when we're security forces, whether it be intelligence, military, or the police, are not involved with conflicts around the world, their main aim, their main target is our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Let's go back to 1989.
Let's talk about NATO.
November 1989, which I mentioned, end of Soviet tyranny. If anybody believed the propaganda that they had heard for the last 50 years, they would have predicted that NATO would disappear. I mean, the justification for NATO was it's protecting the West from the Russian hordes. Okay, the Russian hordes are gone. What happens to NATO? It should have gone as well. Did it? No, it expanded. And that teaches you something. Actually, what happened in detail is quite interesting. Gorbachev made a remarkable concession to the West. He agreed to let Germany form a united Germany, join a Western military alliance, a hostile military alliance. Now, if you just look at history, it's pretty clear what an amazing concession that was. I mean, Germany alone had almost destroyed Russia several times in the preceding century. And now Gorbachev was saying, okay, united Germany can be rearmed and can join a hostile military alliance, which makes it much more powerful. Well, of course, there was he thought he made an agreement. He thought that the West, meaning the United States, was agreeing not to let NATO expand to the east. The phrase was not 1 inch to the east, meaning NATO would not extend to East Germany and, of course, would not extend further. And also, he thought he had a promise that NATO would become a more political organization. So the President Bush and the Secretary of State, James Baker, did promise that. They promised NATO would become a more political organization. It would not extend 1 inch to the east. However, Gorbachev made a serious error. And if any of you are intending to take on a course in diplomacy, you might pay attention to it. He only got a verbal promise. He thought it was a gentleman's agreement. You don't make gentlemen's agreements with savage, violent powers. So they made sure not to write it down. It was never written in words. It was just a gentleman's agreement. We have no doubt about what was said. Helmut Kohl said the same thing. Genscher said the same thing. Yeah, we promise not to extend 1 inch to the east. Well, what happened? NATO immediately expanded to East Germany, and under Clinton it expanded much farther through Eastern Europe, right up to the borders of the Soviet Union. Well, you know, Gorbachev was pretty upset, naturally, and the Russians reacted. There was more. Gorbachev had offered a nuclear weapons-free zone from the Arctic down to the Mediterranean. The U.S. didn't even consider that. It wasn't even discussed. And NATO has, in fact, expanded. Well, it's now not only going to the east, the happens to be Dutch Secretary General of NATO announced about a year ago that NATO has to take responsibility for the entire global energy system. So it has to what's called protect, meaning ensure that we own the sea lanes, the pipelines, and so on. And there was just a conference about 2 weeks ago in Washington headed by former Secretary of State Albright, which had a new, I forgot the name of it, it had a new mission for NATO to expand worldwide. Well, NATO is a US-run military force, and it's now becoming an international, global US intervention force. And the purpose of it, one purpose of it, is to, exactly as the questioner said, to integrate Europe into the US-dominated military system. That's what NATO was for in the first place. One goal of NATO from the very beginning was to block Gaullist initiatives, to make sure that Europe would not move in an independent course. And as the pretext for NATO disappeared, namely the Russians, we can now see what it's all about. Now NATO is expanded. No Russians, but it's expanded to a global US-run military intervention force in which Europe is absorbed. Now, Europe is dragging its feet. It's not doing it enthusiastically enough. And about a week ago, there was an important article by Richard Haas. He's the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's kind of like the main non-governmental foreign relations establishment institution. He's a former high policymaker. The title of the article, which appeared in the London Financial Times, if you want to look it up, the title is Goodbye Europe. It says, Europe is no longer playing its proper role as a major actor in world affairs because it's not violent enough. Meaning, the point is Europe is refusing to provide sufficient military force for the U.S.-run global programs of controlling, the world by force. So goodbye, Europe. You're not violent enough, so we don't want you anymore. We'll take somebody else. Actually, he doesn't really mean goodbye, Europe. It's just a chastising Europe for their failures to have an adequate commitment to violence. But you still have to be absorbed in the U.S.-run system.
So NATO is, quote, the alliance of which Canada has devoted perhaps 90% of its military effort since 1943. And that's a large portion. So this is why it's so important for us to understand what NATO is that no, Canada's military policy is not about being a peacekeeping nation. Canada's military policy is about being in line with NATO. And to Noam Chomsky's point, NATO is a US-led military intervention force. And you think we learn our lesson after World War I, what happens when you make military alliances with several nation states. Also important to understand the history there of NATO expanding into the East. And we're wondering why we have a war in Ukraine right now, when it's the expansion of NATO right into Ukraine, which was the buffer zone between NATO and Russia. And now you're going to have NATO right on the doorstep of Russia. So it's a totally provoked incident. And so, and then NATO, for its intended purpose was for that conflict is over, and yet we still have NATO. So a government program started never ends. And this one is a dangerous one because they're increasing their military power and might to be used around the world. So we are really implemented in the West, including the United States' conflicts, war, and foreign policy because of our involvement with NATO. So moving on in Canada's military policy. So economic stability and the global South. Canadian security concerns extend beyond Canadian borders, despite Canada having no clear foreign enemy and not being at meaningful risk of attack. Most armed conflicts in the world of the last half century have taken place in the global South. Canada's post-Cold War foreign security policy is filled with ambiguous rhetoric such as, quote, instability, quote, uncertainty, quote, Canadian interests, quote, failed states. And here's a quote, the dangers of the Cold War have been replaced by a new and evolving threats. Today's military operations are more complex, dangerous, and demanding. End quote. And that is from our defense minister between 2004 and 2006. So he's saying we have an evolving threat. It's more dangerous. The battlefield's more dangerous and more complex. And this is in the late 2000s. Like, we fought World War I and we fought World War II. And yet they're saying future conflicts are going to be more dangerous. Once again, it's those in power justifying their power. And when it comes to the civil service, it's the civil service justifying their jobs. Here's another quote. The world remains a very unpredictable and dangerous place. Canada's defense is tied to stability in the rest of the world, end quote. So that's our defense minister from 2006, 2007, talking about that the stability around the world again. In 1994, there was a defense white paper, quote, Cold War stability has given way to instability and uncertainty. The world in many ways a more dangerous place than it has been for the past 40 years. If anything, we are in a more unstable and unpredictable international environment. That the balance of terror that has hung over the world since 1950, end quote. The country must, quote, prepare for instability because instability in the world will inevitably affect Canadians and their interests, end quote. So what exactly is this stability, predictability, and certainty that the government in Canada wants? And so using rather ambiguous terms to justify military policy and going to war. So what they mean by stability is stability of its economic interests being defended. Policymakers are explicit about this. So in the technical paper, Shaping the Future of the Canadian Forces, a Strategy for 2020, quote, disparities between developed and developing nations will remain. Canada's need for international trade and the global stability which permits that trade to flourish, end quote. Quote, our economic future depends on the global stability to trade freely with other nations. As a major trading nation, we are therefore compelled by interest to protect and promote international peace and security, end quote. So what are they talking about when we're talking about stability? They're talking about economic stability in these nation states. And what did we learn about economic stability in the episode on foreign policy and the episode on corporations? They're talking about a form of stability where our major multinational Western corporations go in and take what they want.
The real costs of the war of terror cannot be measured in dollars and cents. They are not tallied in a ledger. They are not about money at all. The real cost is paid in blood. The blood of 1 million dead Iraqis. The blood of the hundreds of thousands of murdered men, women, and children in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The blood that is being shed right now in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and in all of the countries that have crossed through the crosshairs of the NATO, American, and Israeli terrorists. It's measured in the devastation of towns and cities that once bustled with life, in the families torn apart by drone bombings, in the havoc of the hundreds of thousands forced to flee their homes, leave their families and their homeland and their former life behind, as everything they knew is torn to shreds. It's measured in the blood of the servicemen and women themselves, lied to, propagandized, and indoctrinated their entire lives, given a ticket out of grinding poverty by the military, shot up with experimental vaccines, and shoved into the meat grinder for tour of duty after tour of duty. And then, upon returning home, left to rot in rundown hospitals and ignored by the glad-handing politicians and their military-industrial cronies as a suicide epidemic gradually thins their ranks. This is the true cost of the war of terror, and it is incalculable. And none of it, absolutely none of it, will come to an end until the public stops believing the false narrative of the war of terror and the lies that have brought it about. Much like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, The real terrorists can only survive if you believe in them.
So we spent the last 2 hours of this episode doing that systems analyst of what war, the reasons behind war and the policies behind war. And it's easy to get caught up in understanding the lies and that it's made for the bases of the rulers. But we also got to remember that the real cost of war, it's the murder, it's the bloodshed, it's the harm that's being done on our planet. So we've gone through the ostensible purpose of war, and let's wrap this up with the true purpose of war. The true purpose of war is to create foreign threats through false flag attacks, institute imperialism for the ruling class around the world, place nation states in massive debt to the bankers, create large profits for military industrial corporations, create an economy of war for the benefit of the few, which is a form of crony capitalism and a form of socialism, control the energy resources of the world, and be psychopathic and not care who they harm. I will finish this off with a quote. "Beware the leader who bangs the drums of war in order to whip the citizenry into a patriotic fervor, for patriotism is indeed a double-edged sword. It both emboldens the blood just as it narrows the mind. And when the drums of war have reached a fever pitch, and the blood boils with hate, and the mind has closed, the leader will have no need in seizing the rights of the citizenry. Rather, the citizenry, infused with fear and blinded by patriotism, will offer up all their rights unto the leader, and gladly so. How do I know? For this is what I have done, and I am Caesar."
Susan Brothers, thanks everyone for being here. We're from the organization March Forward. We're here to say to all those serving in the Army and the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy that you have the absolute right to refuse to take part in these criminal wars, and that's a right that all of you should exercise. You have no reason to go put your life on the line and kill and die for profit. We've been to Iraq, we've been to Afghanistan, and we know what these wars are really about. And we joined the military for many reasons. Because we need a college education, because we need a job, because we need health care. And then we joined the military, and they tell us that our enemies are poor people in caves in Afghanistan, or poor people in the deserts of Iraq. But we've been to those countries, and we know that our enemies are not other poor people abroad. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs, that denied us health care, that make it impossible to get an education. Our enemies are not in the poorest countries on the planet, but right here in the richest one. The occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan alone are costing over $700 million every single day. This is a crime every single day, while so many of us are hurting. Well, I think all of us here and the vast majority of people in this country would agree that we can spend $700 million a day better than bombing people that we have no reason to bomb. We can spend $700 million a day rebuilding those countries we've destroyed. We can spend $700 million a day caring for the veterans we get home when they get home, and then we can spend $700 million a day giving every single person health care, a college education, a job, and a livelihood, and a home. That's who we need to be spending our money on. But this government is not going to do that. They're not going to use the money in that way. They're not going to end the wars. And they're not going to do it because it's not our government. It's It's their government. It's the government of the rich. It's the government of Wall Street, of the oil giants, of the defense contractors. It's their government, and the only language that they understand is shutting down business as usual. And that's what we're doing here today, and we're going to continue to do until these wars are over. It's crystal clear now that these wars are going to continue and expand and go into other countries. That is the trend. That is what we know, that there is perpetual war, and it's only going to stop if the people stand up and stop it. And that's what we're going to do, sisters and brothers. A lot of people ask me, what do we do? Because we all know things are bad. We all see the atrocities on TV. We read about it. We experience it. People always ask, what do I do? Because we always want to know what to do. Do we vote? Do we support a politician? Do we join an organization? What do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. It's simple. We fight. We fight, and we fight, and we fight, and we shut down our workplaces. We shut down our schools. We shut down the streets. We shut down business as usual, and we fight until we force the people in there to do what the people out here want. Because that's how we're going to get around, and we're going to fight until there's not one more bomb drop, not one more bullet fired, not one more soldier coming home in a wheelchair, not one more family slaughtered, not one more day of U.S. imperialism. So let's fight to make that happen. We can do it today, and in the days ahead, we have to fight to end these wars and create a better world, sisters and brothers.